Hi, welcome or welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and I'm in the midst of a mini series centering women in history and books that can help us explore that. The first video, I talked about women historians that I admire, so it wasn't necessarily just text about women's history, but women who were doing the work of historians. So if you're interested in that, I'll link it up here. Many of those books would have been great selections for this video, like Gendered Citizenship, They Were Her Property, Laboring Women, all great selections. I wanted to offer a different selection in this video. So not all of these will be written by women, and not all of these texts are written by historians. So one of the interesting things when you're digging into women's history is that there are a lot of people doing that work outside of the academy. So you'll often see journalists, teachers, all kinds of people putting in the work to further the efforts of producing women's history. And I want to highlight some of that. So you'll see some archaeologists, legal scholars, journalists, and historians in this stack. I'm going to go in chronological order, just in case you have a specific niche interest, or if you are a teacher and you're looking to expand your knowledge of women's history for your course this summer. Hopefully you'll be able to find something for either world or U.S. history or even government. The first one, if we've been friends for a while, I read this a few years ago and I could not stop talking about it on my social media. This is Lady Sapiens, Breaking Stereotypes About Prehistoric Women. And this was originally published in French. I believe there's also a documentary that goes with this. I have not seen that yet. This really transformed my understanding as a teacher. If you don't know because you're not a teacher, unlike at the college level, the courses that you get assigned to teach may or may not align with the history that you studied in your academic journey. So I actually studied modern world history and modern European history, kind of a blend there, for my bachelor's degree. And then all of my graduate level history work has been in U.S. history, both early and modern. And so I needed to expand my knowledge of women's roles, especially in prehistoric societies, in order to more effectively bring them into my class, and this text helped me do that. You can see I have my little takeaway notes and so many things marked. I actually started my class a couple years ago by reading a section of this with my students before we even fully began the course. And I just found this to be a really great way to kick off a history course and thinking about how the story of the past has evolved over time as new people have entered the field, whether that be archaeology or history, and through their different positionalities, they asked new questions that had not been asked before, which led to looking at data in different ways, looking specifically in this at artifacts and in different ways, looking in different places, and then building out a story that was much more nuanced than what had previously been known. Here, I wrote to myself that my big takeaway is that the lens one chooses to use, the context in which one exists, and one's positionality influence the questions posed and the possibilities presented. The story of prehistory is long from finished. So definitely check that out. Even if you're not a teacher, it's a great book. Next one that I want to recommend is When Women Ruled the World, and this is written by an Egyptologist, Dr. Cooney. She is a professor at UCLA, and this was another text that I picked up because I felt like when I looked at the standards and the curricular materials for teaching, specifically ancient world history, it was just so heavily dominated by men. There were a few women in there. As you get, especially later in the period, like Cleopatra comes up much later, but generally it was so heavily dominated by men. And so I saw a quick little animated video about Hatshepsut, and I was like, oh my gosh, she is so cool. I have to know more. And this book helped me dig into her specifically, but also many other women that I had not encountered previously. She breaks down 6 queens of Egypt. And again, I have to recommend this book for Hatshepsut alone if you don't pick it up for any other reason, because just looking at the intentional erasure of her existence and the power that she held is such a foundational, important way to approach the study of understanding the past and women's history. And it's not that women didn't do anything of value. It's not that they weren't in influential spaces, but really that there were concerted efforts, even when they were in highly visible spaces of power, to erase that, to potentially prevent that from happening repeatedly in the future. So highly recommend this one. I enjoyed it tremendously. If you are a teacher, I have a lesson that I created about Hatshepsut. I was so inspired by this that I went out and I found some primary source materials, images of artifacts, etc. It's free on my website, historywithtiffany.com. You can go and grab it. It's a Google Doc, and make your own copy and edit it and use it. Please do. That's why it's there. I really want to help teachers get more meaningful history into their classes. So highly recommend. If you were looking for something short to read this summer to really just fire you up about women's history, you cannot go wrong with Mary Beard, Women and Power. Now, I wouldn't necessarily classify this as a history, but there is a ton of women's history in here because she is tracing the history of women and power and masculinity throughout this text. And it's just punch after punch, and she does a beautiful job making connections to the present and how you can see people looking to the past and pulling these strategies to marginalize women and their voices. And it's just, and like actually silence women. It's a wonderful text. And like I said, it's so short. One of the things that for my doctoral research and even my history research that I did for my master's degree, one of the things that I have been really frustrated by is the sequestering of women into certain topics. It's not that those things aren't important, it's that we limit women to those spaces. And that's really inaccurate. Like even thinking about the Equal Rights Amendment, and I'll link a video up here that I have on that, the very first push and the conflict over the Equal Rights Amendment was tied into a much larger national conversation, and how that went through, the way it was tangled up in the Lochner era and those court cases is really quite fascinating. And so when we sequester this to this was a women's issue, women's voices should be heard here, etc., and we don't look at even women's issues in the larger context of history, we're really coming up short with how we are presenting women's roles in society. Women have been a part of every major moment in all of history, whether you're looking at ancient world history, modern world history, whatever it is, women have been intricately tied into those events. They were there for everything. One of the big quotes from Mary Beard that I like is, she says, "I'm not saying that women's voices raised in support of women's causes were not or are not important. Someone has to speak up for women, but it remains the case that women's public speech has for centuries been niched into that area." And she traces not only historic examples of that, but modern ones. So I think if women's history is something that you're looking at and you want to look at it more critically and you really want to situate it meaningfully in the scope of the larger story of the past, this is a really good framework to explore and think through in advance of that. The next one is Femina, which you've probably seen. This one came out with kind of a splash, maybe more so than some of the others, but it was absolutely an adventure to read. I truly enjoyed this. So again, we're kind of going in order chronologically, but as someone who taught history that I did not study specifically, I really put in the effort to find women. Where are they in the course? And so when I got to the medieval period, I was like, okay, help me find the women that I'm looking for. Give me a starting point. This was written by Dr. Ramirez. She is a lecturer at, I believe, Oxford University. Yes, and she does art and cultural history. She's worked on BBC history documentaries, etc. So It was a joy to read. It read very accessibly, whereas sometimes you read a book on history and it can feel a little dry and it's like, oh, I need some plot. This one is really interesting. And the part that I pulled out of this that I found so fascinating, and then I ended up branching off from this and going and finding some studies in this area myself, was the section on the bubonic plague. How studies have looked at the race of skeletons of people who died during the bubonic plague, and looking at the difference between race. They identified that in 2021 London census, around 60% of the population is recorded as white, with the remaining 40% listed as Asian, Black, mixed, and other. But the results of this study suggest that if you were to walk the streets of medieval London, you could expect to encounter a similarly diverse range of people. I think there is this misconception that the majority of people in the past historically were white in the UK, and that's simply not the case based on those data that they found. The other really interesting thing was looking at a Black woman that they found, and they used her as a case study, and they found that her development, like through childhood, based on her skeleton, her bone, like the bones, her teeth, etc., that she was actually much healthier than someone who would have grown up in London, because outside of the city, specifically in the Mediterranean and Northern Africa, there was actually a much healthier development that children had, whereas the city was overcrowded, the sanitation was bad. And those of you, again, who teach world history or who study that, that will be something that you're very familiar with. But I just really enjoyed this study. And if you do go to my website, you can see the presentation that I did a couple years ago at the National Council for the Social Studies Conference. And if you go through to the medieval section, I link that study, and I also pulled some information there for how that could be brought into a classroom. It would be, I didn't put together the full lesson, I just put together the source material, so you could pull from that if you wanted to bring something from this in. But again, those of you that are not teachers and you're just looking to explore women's history from a new, interesting lens, I highly recommend Femina. By the way, that section that I was talking about was one small section, a much larger text. All right, the next is a more recent read for me. I actually just finished this text and I marked it up. It was absolutely wonderful. And this was Unceasing Militant, The Life of Mary Church Terrell by historian Allison N. Parker. Hold on. I actually have, because of this book, I now have To Tell the Truth Freely, The Life of Ida B. Wells by historian Mia Bay on my TBR, because the story between these two, as well as what was happening with all the other women in the feminist movement, was fascinating, what I got from this book. So it's like, I really want to look at it and maybe look at Ida B. Wells a little more deeply. I've read Ida B. Wells' work, have her Southern Horrors and other writings. I've read other pieces of her work as well, but I really wanted to jump in as I know that Mia Bay's work has been praised by others. So I highly recommend this one, Unceasing Militant. And if you love it as much as I do, then maybe you'll also check out To Tell the Truth Freely, because I think these two complement each other nicely. If you are looking to expand your knowledge of mid to late 19th century history, specifically looking at abolition, Reconstruction, and then Restoration that followed, and then leading up to first wave feminism, the 19th Amendment, what all of the conflict that occurred there, the divisions that occurred between feminist groups, the conflicts over the Equal Rights Amendment. I just think looking at that, not just through Alice Paul, who is amazing, or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is, you know, she had a role to play in all of this, but really expanding beyond just the main figureheads to dive more deeply and get a more nuanced perspective of the work that women were doing to bring about change. And yeah, so I recommend this one, and then maybe we can buddy read this one. I don't know. Let me know if you've read this or if you pick it up. This next one kind of goes along with that same period, and this is Constitutional Orphan, Gender Equality, and the 19th Amendment. And this is actually written by a legal scholar, Paula Monopoly, and this was fantastic. If you don't know, my interest in history is not just in women's history, but I really like to look at how women and the law have interacted throughout history, especially looking at places where women might often be missing from that story. Now, this is focused on the 19th Amendment, so you're like, but wait a second, isn't that really a woman's issue? And didn't you just say that women often get sequestered to that? Yes, but this actually dives a bit more deeply. It's not so superficial as a lot of histories on the 19th Amendment aren't. And what this is actually diving into is not the fight for the 19th Amendment, but what happened after the 19th Amendment. So the 19th Amendment has an enforcement legislation piece to it, just like the Reconstruction Amendments, 13, 14, 15. Some might argue that the 19th Amendment is an extension of those Reconstruction ideals, along with the Voting Rights Act that came later. With this, what she's arguing is that because Paul and the National Woman's Party did that quick pivot to the Equal Rights Amendment, there wasn't even a huge amount of test cases that were done. There wasn't really any pressure on Congress to push through any enforcement legislation. So we really don't know how far the 19th Amendment could have been stretched in order to increase women's rights, and leaving it at just the simple women now have the right to vote was perhaps an oversight. I personally find this interesting because digging deeply into the Equal Rights Amendment and that history, specifically the first conflict, the legal department of the National Woman's Party was going out and digging into state laws and state constitutions and seeing how women were being treated after the 19th Amendment was ratified. And it, to them, in their minds, this was too overwhelming of an issue to just wait around for test cases and then enforcement legislation and then having that go through the courts and seeing what could happen with that. So for them, it was like, no, we need a blanket amendment now because this is going to take too long. But then you had women like Florence Kelley, who had been working for years to get special legislation for women and labor, in the area of labor specifically. And because they were jumping to the Equal Rights Amendment, and you had like the National Consumers League and Florence Kelley on the other side, it was just this complete breakdown. And it's easy to look back and say, well, if maybe they had just pushed for some enforcement legislation or this or that, but then you also have to think of it from the NWP's perspective, and they could only see what they could see within their scope of knowledge. And it just looked so overwhelming when they were looking at the state laws and constitutions that existed and how that was marginalizing women. And they just didn't think that they would be able to tackle all of that through this alone. And so whether it's exactly how you see it or not, especially if, like me, you've read a lot of work at this point on that specific pivot that the NWP made, I think this is really foundational. I don't know if enough people are talking about this. I really loved it. Really had me thinking from a different perspective what might have been that contingency factor, which was really interesting. So Paula Monopoly, Constitutional Orphan. We're now going into second wave feminism. So Feminist Coalition, this is really kind of a niche recommendation, but I really appreciate nuance in women's history. It is something that I think we're missing in pretty much all of history when it comes to secondary history curricula, mostly because of time, access to resources, etc. But I feel like we really miss the diversity in some of these movements, diversity of opinions, conflicts. How did they move through these conflicts? How did they get on the path that they did? And how did this become the primary path that they took? And this is a collection of essays that I feel like really breaks down religion, class, race, so many factors that were playing into how women were moving and shaking in what is often referred to as the second wave of feminism. So if you are really into history and you're really looking to round out your understanding of this period, I highly recommend this. If you are a history student and you are going to be writing about this period specifically, I think this would be a really good resource for you for your historiography and building up your own understanding specifically. Some of my favorite essays were this one by Wendy Klein, which is called The Making of Our Bodies Ourselves, Rethinking Women's Health and Second Wave Feminism. This one is Attentive to Difference, Miss Magazine, Coalition Building and Sisterhood by Amy Farrell. The specific work that I did was looking at Miss Magazine as a piece of protest literature and how they were really able to push and bring together a coalition by using kind of those foundational pieces of protest literature, shock value, empathy, and then kind of this call to action at the end. So this is a good one if that's an area of interest for you. All right, and then one that, again, trying to balance this between like history, studying history, doing history, and then readability. Rosemary, the Hidden Kennedy Daughter, and this is written by Kate Larson. She focuses on women's history, 19th and 20th century American history. This is one of those pieces of history, again, kind of like Femina, where you go into it and yes, it's a history and the work is of really great quality, but it's emotional, it pulls you in, it feels like something that anybody can access and read and take away something. And the story of Rosemary Kennedy, I actually brought this into my psychology and ACE psychology classes when we were talking about ethics. And when you teach psychology, it's really interesting and important that we talk about the complex history of that field. I brought in her story and this book helped me do that, but it was really just a joy to read because of the care that you could feel was in the author's work for telling this story. Into U.S. history, if you are one of the people who's really interested in the Kennedy family, I know that they're kind of trending right now because of the movie or the miniseries that came out. I haven't watched that, but definitely recommend picking up Rosemary. Her story deserves to be heard, as do the thousands of other women who experienced similar fates. And then I'm still kind of in that same period, but these last two are going to pull from the past up to the present. First is We the Women. So this is the Unstoppable Mothers of the Equal Rights Amendment. It's written by Julie Sook. She is a legal scholar. I highly recommend this as a starting point if you want to start dipping your toes into understanding the Equal Rights Amendment, who was involved with it, some of the conflict that occurred. This is what I would say would be the entry point to that. So in my last video, I talked about historian Rebecca DeWolf's gendered citizenship. I think that's like a step 2. So if you haven't explored the Equal Rights Amendment, the legal framework around that, how it could still be beneficial in the present, We the Women is a good place to begin. And then last but not least, this is an interesting one because it bridges my doctoral research and my history work. That is by Rawson Solinger, Reproductive Justice. I read this when I was working on developing my framework, my theoretical framework for my doctoral dissertation. This played into my understanding of intersectionality, the conflict that has occurred between women because of the different lived experiences and therefore pushing for different goals through the law and in society. So if you are interested in reproductive rights, I would encourage you to think about reproductive justice. This is an introduction, but it gives such a detailed history. You can see I have marked it up. It's absolutely wonderful. Give myself a little note. It's a history of the modern experience of women in the U.S. through the intersectional lens of reproductive justice. And that little sentence is a perfect exploration. And that is 10 books with a couple extras and a couple mentions from the last video that I highly recommend to you if you are looking to further your knowledge of women's history. I hope you enjoy them. If you've read any of these, let me know. Or if you pick one up based on this video, please come back and let me know what you think, something that you learned, and I will see you in the next one, which I'm excited about. It is about historical fiction, either written by women or that centers women. All right, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks so much. Bye, y'all.